Who taught you how to do this stuff?
You, all right? I learned it by watching you.
Best of all, I can play online games against anyone I want all day long without anyone nagging me. Yes, get in there. Who said all good things must come to an end?
They really don't like emulation, do they? Emulators have been a pretty hot topic recently, what with Nintendo killing off Yuzu earlier this year, but it's not exactly the first time a company's done this. Companies in general fucking hate emulators, and even just normal people seem to not like them as well sometimes, and I don't really know why. Basically, I just wanted to make a piece to stick up for emulators and explain why I think they're fucking awesome. They are so good and helpful in so many ways for playing older games. I should preface that making this argument is considered somewhat cliché. It's always brought up, but it is for a good reason. We can all agree that nobody wants to be locked out of content for any reason, especially if that reason is just that the publishers don't care to preserve the work they've done. So to try and avoid being cliché, I first want to look at games which we never got the opportunity to try officially. Cheetah Men was an absolutely awful game for the NES, which was included in Action 52, a $200 cartridge containing 52 games, made infamous by a certain angriest gamer we've ever heard.
Pretty much. You could take $199, stand on a bridge and just throw it all away. You'd rather do anything than spend it on a broken down, dysfunctional disaster of video game programming.
Cheetah Men clearly had the most effort put into it out of all 52 games, even if that effort wasn't a lot. If you ask me, the whole thing reeks of gambler's fallacy, and if I've ever seen an argument against gambling, it's this, because out of 52 games, none of them were even passable. Fun fact, whilst researching I found out that Jay Obernault, the director for the Mega Drive version of Action 52, actually went on to become a politician, and is now a Republican senator. This is fun because it means that somebody who worked on Action 52 now has say in American law. It seems that they'd planned for Cheetah Men to branch off into this big multimedia franchise with things like action figures and comics planned to springboard off of this game, but unfortunately for them, this didn't pan out and the game was a flop. And because of this, the planned sequel, Cheetah Men 2, was cancelled in the end. Yet the game still leaked years later and people managed to get their hands on it. I'll let the nerd explain this one again since I think he's more knowledgeable on shitty NES games than I am.
The cartridges were taken to a warehouse where they remained for years to come. It was never meant to be played. Then, in the late 90s, a massive break-in took place. The cartridges were discovered and became valuable collector's items.
And it was incredibly valuable, with the game today fetching prices of up to $2,000. You're probably wondering why I'm explaining all of this to you, because this probably seems like a really bad example to bring up first, since I don't think anybody really cares if they can't play Cheetah Men 2, but I don't think that's the point. Any game deserves to be played and analysed. It's this that allows aspiring developers to see what works and what doesn't in games. This analysis can be even more interesting for unreleased or bootleg games that can't be acquired by regular methods. It can be interesting to see why developers decided that the game couldn't make it out. Plus, it can be helpful to understand what good ideas were there that could be foraged. Even if the example I'm using is one with no good ideas. One of the examples which I personally find most interesting of unreleased games is that Capcom planned and mostly developed a full remake of the first Resident Evil for the Game Boy Color, and they'd also planned a similar, yet less complete treatment for Resident Evil 2 on the Game Boy Advance. Thanks to resources such as the cutting room floor, we do have a lot of the information regarding both of these games, and prototypes of both were leaked years ago. Obviously, I don't think anyone's thinking that the Game Boy Color or Game Boy Advance are ways to play these games, but it is so interesting to see how they had to get these PlayStation games to work on these, by comparison, primitive handhelds. My point I'm trying to put forward here is how much can be done using emulation, and why I don't think the argument of just get the games officially holds any water. Not every unreleased game can be a Star Fox 2 and eventually be made publicly. Stuff like SimCity's NES port, Socks the Cat Rocks the Hill, or Sonic Extreme. They're all weird games that we would have never been able to try out without software emulation, and each of them are such strange little oddities. Even if they seem insignificant to you, they're likely to be interesting to somebody. As an example of this, my friend Eleanor, who I got to read over the script, actually is a big fan of SimCity and had no idea there was an NES port. So there's people who are interested in this stuff. It's not just weirdos like me. I think now would be a good time to address the elephant in the room when it comes to this argument, which is games that haven't been localized yet. And Mother 3 is obviously the biggest example of this, and to be fair, there is no clear reason as to why in 18 years we still don't have one of the most acclaimed RPGs of all time outside of Japan. As cliche as an example as it is, I think it's important to bring it up because it's a perfect example of this issue. If Earthbound is one of your favourite games, do you think it's fair for Nintendo to not let you enjoy the sequel based on where you live? And it doesn't exactly feel reasonable to just wait around for it to be re-released, when you can literally just get a fan translation. I have heard one argument tried to be made against this, and I think it's a little bit silly.
Here's a really good example. This was until recently, one of the excuses that fanboys used to sort of justify why emulation needed to exist, because certain games don't get English releases. The third Mana game did not get an English release until this collection of Mana. And that was the excuse that the guy I made fun of a while back used in his video, that like, well, you're never ever going to play this game in English, so you have to pirate it, which is complete bullshit, right? Because they did release it. They did eventually.
Maybe Seiken Densetsu 3 did eventually earn a localization as Trials of Mana, but that isn't a fair way to view the matter, because it implies that every single game will one day be localized, and that isn't really realistic. Seiken Densetsu 3's quality was shared heavily as Seiken Densetsu 2 fans discovered that a game they loved did get a sequel. Most of us are familiar with Seiken Densetsu 2 under the name Secret of Mana, and I think Square knew this popularity that it had, and the popularity that then the sequel gained online when people had translated it and actually played it, and shared online how good they actually thought it was. And I don't think without that they would have ever bothered with localizing the game at any point. But re-releases aren't exactly something we can hope for every game, at all. Whether it's because of translation issues or because of licensing issues, most games just aren't able to be re-released. If you're a big fan of the Back to the Future movies like me, then you probably know that the games released on the NES and Mega Drive were pretty fucking awful. But what if I told you that there was actually a pretty decent Back to the Future game in Japan only? Super Back to the Future 2 was a not perfect but surprisingly solid platformer for the Super Famicom. And once again, if you're not Japanese, then you can't play it officially. And the thing is, we don't know whether they're ever going to re-release Mother 3, but there's at least hope there. The developer knows that the want is there, but something like this is just never going to be re-released. Being an English speaker, I think my personal experience in online content is almost entirely centered around games being Japan exclusive, but that's not to say it doesn't happen the other way around. It could be easy to view Japan as getting everything, but localization is a lot more split up than that. The Japanese never particularly got on with Spyro. I don't know why, maybe Purple Dragons are considered a real faux pas over there, but because of that, Spyro 1 and 2 sold pretty poorly over there. And due to this, my personal favourite Spyro game, number 3, was never released in Japan. For once, one of my favourite games took decades for Japan to play. And Americans, don't join in on the laughter yet, because you lot never got to play my favourite rhythm game ever made, Vib Ribbon. Don't feel too bad though, lads. It's not that much harder for you to get a copy of it than it is for us. It may seem like a random example, but it really hit me in a weird way, finding out that Japan never got a game I consider a classic. Living in the UK, it's not uncommon for some amazing games to have not reached me at their release. Chrono Trigger, Final Fantasy pre-Final Fantasy VII, and Harvest Moon 64 are all some of my favourite games ever, but I was always sad to find out they weren't easily available to me as a physical collector. And again, I think that emulation is just the best way to preserve all these games. This problem of inaccessibility isn't just for unlocalized games. I mean, take basically any older licensed game and it's likely a mess of ownership. One of the most influential games ever, GoldenEye, literally only just got out of purgatory, and that's only because the companies spent 25 years busting their balls to make it happen. But how many companies do you think are willing to do that for their licensed games? Most of them were made to cash in on a popular franchise, so it's very rare that we actually get them remastered. In fact, I can only think of a very few off the top of my head. When it comes to preservation and localization, you always hear the same examples, but for me I think the more obscure stuff is more important. Hope may be dwindling, but Mother 3 is absolutely popular enough that a localization in a few years is not off the cards entirely. But to get a comprehensive library of all these games, we need the weirder stuff to be preserved just as much. And obviously I think emulation is the only way that that's actually possible. Okay, so you've got your emulator, you've got all your games. What can you do now that you can't do on actual consoles? Whenever I'm looking to play a new game, I always like to research which version is best. Most of the time I do like to play a game's original release, but for multi-platform titles it can be a bit more up in the air. It used to be down to just what I happened to own, hence why I played the shitty version of Sonic Heroes when I was younger. But these days I get the freedom of whatever version I want to play. Picking the best version isn't always cut and dry though, with console limitations or different features or whatever. So what if we could just ignore all that and make our own ideal version? One of the earliest big examples of a popular fan translation is that of Final Fantasy V. This fan translation was actually released very closely to Square's official localization in the Final Fantasy Anthology, and as such both translations were compared closely at the time. Hilariously enough, the fan translation, which was developed by a couple of high school students, actually ended up being the much preferred version of the game. Most urgently though, the fan translation translated the protagonist's name as Butts, and the fact that this was removed from the official release has still upset me to this day. Now, I'm not trying to say that either version of this game is better than the other, but you can see why limiting people to just one version of a game creates issues, because they all have their own different qualities. And if, like me, you want to play the Super Nintendo version, then it's a lot easier to just emulate a translated ROM than to import a copy of the game and a Super Famicom and then learn a whole new language. Without these unofficial methods, the user experience is made so much worse. Final Fantasy V is actually one of my favourite Final Fantasy games, but if I try to recommend it to people, I'm always unsure of what version to recommend. The beauty of emulation is that they can have access to all of them and make up their own mind based on the pros and cons of each version. Like it or not, emulation breeds accessibility. You play your games how it suits you, and that's by far my favourite part about it. But what if it's too difficult to choose between different versions, and you'd rather just have one perfect version? Well, why can't we just build our own perfect version of a game? Chrono Trigger is one of my favourite games of all time. It has been fortunate enough to receive several versions over the years, all with their own specific drawbacks and additions. The initial Super Nintendo release is nothing short of a technical marvel for the time. Visually, the game is stunning. Character designs and art were all handled by industry heavyweight Akira Toriyama, who is best known for his work on Dragon Ball and Dragon Quest. These designs were translated to the SNES incredibly well, despite any potential limitations. By 1995, it felt as if developers were comfortable enough with the hardware to be able to make games look and feel unrecognisably artistic compared to the launch titles. Character art from the 80s and 90s was always made to show the player what the pixels in-game are trying to convey, to help your mind fill in the blanks of the unique details. Even for a game of the SNES era, Chrono Trigger pulls you into its atmosphere shockingly effortlessly. I couldn't describe it as anything less than beautiful. The backgrounds managed to look luscious on 16-bit hardware and make the game one of the most stunning games of its generation, or even I'd consider of all time. These environments are backed up with a moody and captivating soundtrack. I'm somebody who rarely will listen to game music on its own, but Chrono Trigger is one of the few examples where I consider its soundtrack to just be a great album on its own that I'd put on to listen to. Yasunori Mitsuda and Nobuo Uematsu really crafted something special with this game's score. I think the most perfect way I would describe the game is a team firing on all cylinders. The music is unreal, visually the game is otherworldly, the story constantly kept me on my toes, gameplay is fantastic with the engaging ATB system borrowed from the Final Fantasy games of the time. Pacing is some of the best I've ever played in a game. It's a relatively short JRPG, but it uses that time to pack in all that it needs to, and doesn't slow down for filler at any stage, having just a constant stream of engaging content. Alright, I know what you're probably thinking. Okay, Chrono Trigger's awesome, but why are you telling me all of this in a video about emulation?
You're right. Quite right.
Well, all of Chrono Trigger's different versions are all stuck with their own different pros and cons. For example, the PlayStation 1 version of the game has absolutely awful load times, to the extent that while capturing footage, I thought that beginning a battle the game had cracked. It's a shame because obviously being a CD-based console, the music was able to sound even clearer, and the game even added fully animated cutscenes. The DS version kept these cutscenes, and is probably the best version in my opinion, although the music doesn't really sound great. And I think we all know that playing a DS game on single-screen hardware is never really ideal. So again, how do we create a perfect version of the game? This is MSU1. I have absolutely no idea how they did it, but they managed to get CD quality audio coming out of SNES games. On top of this, we can now have full motion video on the SNES, combining some of the best qualities of later re-releases into the original release, and cutting out a lot of the drawbacks that came with the later revisions. And features like this aren't just tied to Chrono Trigger. SNES games can be upscaled to HD now, with HD Mode 7, and they can have immaculate results. You can even have widescreen hacks. They don't always work perfectly, but it's still incredible how much can be done. How about gameplay mods to add features in for your convenience? Now, I know I mentioned the game earlier, but personally Secret of Mana has never been one of my favourite SNES games, but I know it means a lot to many people. And unfortunately, the 2018 remake, which I thought might have fixed a few of my issues, turned out to be a massive crock of shit. This was especially annoying, since a lot of the little improvements made in that remake were pretty handy, and were great additions to a game that I thought hadn't aged perfectly. Things like changing direction while running, holding more items, and spell hotkeys were added, so it's just a shame we need to play the shitty version to have them. While using the power of emulation, many of them are able to be applied to the superior version. Spell button shortcuts, increasing the number of items that can be held, changing directions whilst running, they're all here, but it goes beyond the remake's additions. My personal favourite is faster weapon and spell grinding. My least favourite part of Secret of Mana is how every weapon and spell you collect throughout the game starts at level 1. This does make sense, however levelling them takes a huge amount of time, which means that late game spells that are essentially required for some bosses need to be grinded a lot to be usable. With a simple patch, this process can be sped up significantly. I think that this is the beauty in ROM patches and hacks. Yeah, we can improve on games people already love, but it can allow for us to enjoy games we previously couldn't get into. After I finished Secret of Mana a good few years ago, I never really had any intention to return to it due to a lot of the problems I had playing it, but I genuinely think these hacks could give me a new reason to do a full playthrough, and see if I can feel what it is everybody else loves. I adore the music and the visuals so much, but a lot of other stuff puts me off. But I'm really trying, I really want to enjoy this game. And again, as mentioned previously, you can get the game on modern platforms with the Collection of Mana. It's a perfectly good version of the game, and I would definitely have no problem recommending it to a first timer, or somebody returning to the game, even with the fact I'm not a big fan of it. I purchased the Collection of Mana on Switch, and while it's a perfectly fine port of the game, it is definitely not bringing anything new. In fairness, I can't blame them too much. I think the fact alone they were localising Seiken Densetsu 3 was enormous, and I can imagine the value of that being justified for most people. However, even with my commending of the collection, I think it's up to you what you'd rather play. I've personally already paid for the game, so I'm comfortable just playing my own version of it that I've built myself. I don't mean any statement like that to sound as if I'm expecting these features to come back in official re-releases, or that I think something like Collection of Mana is lazy, because preserving the initial release of a game is important to me. It's just that I also think it's important that people can play however they like. And I'm sorry, but I think fan emulation is a country 50 miles ahead of most anything in the games industry. I think in many cases, the gap in quality between unofficial and official emulators comes down to the fact that these companies really don't have much reason to care. Sometimes even the smallest feature from Nintendo is considered a big event. For example, I remember on the Wii U Virtual Console, it was a big deal that they finally added button remapping and save states, which is quite funny to me. Paso Fami in 1995, Nesticle from 97, SNES 9X, ZSNES, all these other emulators had done this before the turn of the millennium. Using the earliest version of SNES 9X, it's basically just as feature-rich as the Wii U Virtual Console, except it looked better without the weird dark filter. Okay, but what about the rewind feature on Switch Online then? That's pretty sharp and ahead of the curve, right? Not really. ZSNES was doing that stuff in the early 2000s as well. Now, Rewind is a nice feature for the Switch to add, but it doesn't really make up for the fact that they removed button remapping. This isn't really a big deal for NES or SNES games, considering the button options they provide are pretty much what most of us would use anyway, but I think it makes N64 games generally unplayable. Nothing about this controller is simple to bring over, meaning nearly every game requires its own unique configuration. Due to how the original controller was shaped, the Z button took up the role of the left trigger, separating it from a position to match R on the Switch pad, which makes the majority of games feel off from the get-go, but imagine playing an FPS but L1 is aim and R2 is fire. Also, the weird buttons make the Zelda games almost unplayable for me personally. One of the item buttons isn't even assigned to a button. You either need to use the right analog stick or use a glorified keyboard shortcut. I mean, I wonder what made them to decide playing with traditional Switch controllers should be so shit for it. And even if the N64 pads weren't so expensive and I was able to have one, I certainly wouldn't want to use it all the time. And that's coming from one of the 12 people who don't really mind the N64 controller. Surely the biggest advantage of having these games on the Switch is that they're now portable, but it's not really a very good portable emulator if I need to carry around another controller to actually play it without getting wanker's cramp. You probably noticed the theme of accessibility and freedom with unofficial options, yet from big companies all we get is a spiced up Y2K build of an old emulator with a note attached just saying, "Be grateful we even bothered." Sorry to keep being negative, but it's kind of baffling to me. Even the remasters of this generation are kind of just the bare minimum. You'll remember Super Mario 3D All-Stars, and you'll probably also remember the game's limited time release strategy. Of course you do. You've been very knowledgeable about Mario 3D All-Stars, and I'm very proud of you for that. Obviously it's been unavailable to buy since March 2021, and I likely don't need to tell you how little these games were upgraded. In terms of additional content, we got soundtracks? I know for some it can feel difficult to complain with having a modern package of two of the greatest games of all time and Mario Sunshine, but it seriously feels like they did the bare minimum. No quality of life features, no bonus features, no Galaxy 2, and they even fucked up the box art PNGs on the back of the box. Why does Galaxy have a DVD case border but Sunshine doesn't? I'd expect this on like a badly made PowerPoint, but from an official Nintendo release, this is insane. Also, Super Mario 64 isn't even supported in Italian. So Mario himself can't even play his game in his most comfortable language. Okay, but jokes aside, these games have just been described as just emulated, as though that's a bad thing. No, using an emulator for the original ROM is not a bad thing, because this isn't an excuse for it to be so limited. I've already shown how an emulator can do more than the original system could, but 3D All-Stars only really bothers making Sunshine and Galaxy upscaled to HD. Nice, definitely, but hardly amazing. Maybe it would have been impressive on Dolphin in 2014, but these games are already pretty modern, so what about Mazda 64? Well, Super Mario 64 was the star attraction, and does have some amazing improvements, like 1080p, 60 frames a second, a full analog camera— oh shit, sorry. I was accidentally reading off from the PC port made by fans. The actual celebration for Mario's 35th anniversary was a 720p upscale of an N64 ROM, with a lovely 4:3 aspect ratio. No customization options, the same camera from the 90s, which everybody points to as the most aged aspect of the game, and the only real change, weird wobbly upscaled textures. They seem to have just been run through an AI upscaler. There is no way this is the best they can do for their biggest franchise's 35th anniversary, and that's not fucking it! The lack of any content from the DS version feels especially cheeky. The other two games in the package are less egregious since the HD widescreen looks stunning and makes them look like modern games and not a slapped-together port, but it's still something we've had for years at this point on Dolphin. I know I sound pessimistic, but Nintendo are more than capable of doing more. Galaxy still utilises the digital camera controls from 2007, and it makes it abundantly clear that you're playing a Wii game. A good remaster doesn't make you feel like you're playing an outdated generation, but should build the game up to the quality of life from games of the current generation and let the aspects which have aged well speak for themselves. I genuinely cannot comprehend the decision not to include a modern second stick camera. Nintendo themselves have done it many times. I can't really point solely at Nintendo for lazy ports because, admittedly, 3D All-Stars is good. It's a perfectly fine version of all three games, and probably the best way to play Galaxy. Some games don't even receive that treatment. Silent Hill 2 is one of my favourite games ever, at least top 5, maybe even top 3, but recommending it is always so difficult, because getting it on PS2 or Xbox is incredibly expensive, and the most modern version is the infamously appalling version in the Silent Hill HD collection. Silent Hill 2's biggest draw is its atmosphere. The dingy world engulfed in fog, the slightly off, Twin Peaks-esque voice acting, and all the world's little details add up to an amazing experience. So how does the HD version do? Broken fog, ugly textures, worse voice acting, and Comic Sans turns a game I consider an artistic breakthrough to something completely laughable. It's this which makes Emulation the only truly easy way I can recommend the game to people. Hopefully this gets across my point. Emulation is essential if you want to explore the most landmark titles in history. I'm aware, again, that in parts of this I may come off especially negative, but that isn't the place that this comes from. I find the effort taken from these larger companies to be so frustrating, simply out of a place of pure fashion. I absolutely love Emulation. From discovering it at an early age, it has stuck with me ever since as an accessible way to discover some of my favourite games. When I was around 7, I found the AVGN and Screw Attack, which maybe I shouldn't have been watching at that young of an age.
Your mother sucks cocks in hell.
But it gave me this real interest in the retro gaming scene. The earliest consoles I had during my childhood were the PS1 and the Game Boy Color, but those were really early memories, and the main consoles I ended up playing as a nipper were the GBA and the PS2. For me at age 7, just seeing this retro gaming scene at the time made me feel as though I'd discovered a whole new world of games from a bygone era. Now I also at that time was big into flash games, as I think anybody my age was. Earn to Die, Protect Your Nuts, Snail Bob, that kind of thing. But my favourite kinds were the ones utilising existing game characters. I'm talking Mario Movie Maker, Zelda The Lampshade of No Real Significance, Super Mario Bros. 63, Super Smash Flash 2, Clinically Obese Mario Brothers, Crash Bandicoot Flash, Super Mario Bros. Crossover, and way too many more. That old laptop could practically be named the Newgrounds machine. I'm bringing this up because my search bar back then typically looked like this, and it wasn't long before I found a website that looked something like this. I mean, at that time I would just type in Zelda games online free because I was looking for Flash games, and eventually I'd stumble across ROM sites, and the ROM sites that would let you play it from within your browser. This was what I'd always wanted. At that age, I had dreamt of one day growing a collection to play these old games. I mean, I'd watched the AVGN, Pro Jared, Cat Icarus, and I'd seen their massive shelves in the background, and at the time I'd thought, one day, when I have the money, when I have everything I can, I will own something like that. But now I could just play all of those games from just a browser. And it was just from this that I discovered what would haunt me to this very day, that being emulation. Upon discovering how easy it was to try all of these games out with my mum's old laptop, I instantly started visiting Emu Paradise to find new favourites. I never finished games or got particularly far at that age, partly from choice paralysis, partly because I would mainly try out whatever the nerd was playing to see how bad it was, but more so because I was 7 or 8 and pretty stupid. Once or twice I'd try something like an RPG, like Earthbound, because I'd seen someone on YouTube say it was good, and I would have absolutely no idea how to play and give up pretty quickly. But it was awesome at that age to try and catch up on all of these games from decades before I was even a drunken drop in the gene pool. And it wasn't about piracy for me either. I mean, I didn't even know what that word fucking meant at the time. I mean, I certainly wasn't earning any money at that age. A few years later, I did discover the Wii Virtual Console, and when the 3DS came out, I did the same thing with that system's Virtual Console. I would only buy stuff off the Virtual Console which I either enjoyed enough to want to finish, or so that I at least had those games at convenience, since I was only permitted on a computer at certain times, whereas the Wii and the 3DS didn't quite have that same restriction. Or just to install games which my precious Dell craptop wouldn't be able to run. Why don't you try playing Majora's Mask at 12 FPS? Considering how I first played the game, it's surprising it's become one of my favourite games ever, because it was fucking rough. Wii and eShop points were like a treat for me at that age. Every birthday and Christmas I wanted them. I may seem to have strayed far from what I was talking about to begin with, but the underlying message is this: emulation is more important than when you think. I wouldn't have spent a small country's GDP on the Wii shop if it wasn't for emulation stoking the interest. Emulation has inspired hundreds of people, some people who actually use this inspiration to do cool and interesting things, and not just gain a love of plastic crap like me. Undertale's Tony Fox got his foot in the door creating ROM hacks with games such as the Earthbound ROM hack, the Halloween hack, and the developers from Sonic Mania, one of the most beloved Sonic games, found their start picking apart and modding ROMs of the classic Sonic game. Without this, their knowledge of what made those games work would not have been as in-depth. Christian Whitehead spent so much time with the original Sonic engines that I wouldn't be surprised if he understood them better than Sega themselves. The Mania team, at the very least, know how to make a better game from it. Sonic Mania is a great example to me, since the accessibility of the emulators and extra features available resulted in an entirely new game crafted from those old ones, and it's now seen as one of, if not the best in the series for Sonic. Not that that's saying a lot, but... Now, despite how much I've banged on about accessibility and how at a young age I was able to try out all of these games for the first time, I don't think emulation can just be boiled down to playing old games for free. Personally, I hate piracy. So much. See, here's proof. Here's my shirt I wear to show people what website they should never go on. See, I'm always wearing it just to show people that they should never go on convenient websites to pirate things and get them for free. But despite piracy, it is an easy way of maintaining a snapshot of important games for history. As I've shown previously, we really can't trust the official copyright holders to care enough about preservation. Without the amazing community efforts, we wouldn't have this unlimited catalogue to be learnt from, understood and enjoyed. Nintendo and Sony can't even stand to be on the same planet as Emulation, yet as discussed, two incredibly popular games on their platforms are a result of what they hate the most. I think now that I've discussed why I love Emulation so much as it is, I really want to move on to looking forward to the future of Emulation and what we could look forward to. The obvious leap will be the ability to emulate the 8th generation of systems, or even one magical day, the 9th generation of systems, in case you really need to play Astro's Playroom on your PC. Nintendo have had a head start with both of these, as both the Wii U and the Switch are emulatable and with perfectly great results. Tears of the Kingdom was running better on Yuzu than Switch over 2 weeks before it had even released. Okay, so what if you're not interested in emulating the Wii U or the Switch and would prefer to emulate superior Gen 8 systems? Well, fortunately for you, the Ouya is perfectly emulatable. Sadly, the shitter consoles of that generation are a tad less emulatable. Of the two, I'll get the easy one out of the way first. No, you can't emulate the Xbox One. So Space Jam, A New Legacy, Xbox Fitness and Kinect Sports Rivals are still trapped on that one system. The sad part is, I just listed a quarter of the Xbox One's exclusive game. Okay, but what about the one with a little bit more meat on its bones, PS4 emulation? Whilst a lot of Sony exclusives like God of War, Spider-Man and Uncharted 4 have dropped their shackles and come to PC, there's still plenty left to make the leap. It may surprise you to hear, but there are in fact a fair few PS4 emulators, but there is one slight issue. The compatibility list can fit on a fucking sticky note. It's early days, with the only playable games being sprite-based ones, or perhaps even homebrew titles. But I'm excited to see this list grow, mostly so Souls fans like this cunt here can shut up about Bloodborne coming to PC. It's tough to predict when we might see 8th gen emulation become a viable way to play games. PS3 and Xbox 360 emulation alone took a few years to become stable, still not being truly perfect nowadays, so I can't see it being a thing for at least a good few years. Hello, so unfortunately what I've just said, I say unfortunate, it's actually quite fortunate, what I've just said about PS4 emulation likely being a few years off, I think is probably wrong now, because there's this emulator called Shad PS4, which has recently become very much more stable in terms of rendering 3D games. In Bloodborne, for example, it's gotten to the character select screen, character creation screen, I mean. And in, I believe, a One Piece game, it managed to boot into the actual gameplay and do 3D rendering, which was the big thing that it couldn't do. So yeah, I'm glad to be made to look like a fool, because it's exciting to have it closer than we thought. But just wanted to put this little addendum in there, because I don't want to be spouting bullshit. I'm really excited to see how PS4 emulation progresses. What if though, instead of looking forward to modern consoles for the future of emulation though, we move backwards a little bit? What about older systems which still are in need of stable emulation? I'm personally a little bit too obsessed with game preservation, and I often hear a point against that as, oh well, we always have those original consoles and those original cartridges or discs, so it's fine because we'll always have those. Which is kind of bullshit. Look at the Philips CDI. Now, the Philips CDI was made using pretty shitty parts for a start. Because of those parts, the system was given a long and generous 30 years before it shits the bed and no longer worked. The CDI had its 30th birthday fucking 2 years ago. Without being able to play these games without emulation, a piece of gaming history would be lost forever. A shitty and difficult piece of gaming history, but still. The games which arose from Nintendo and Sony's fallout are something which I think everybody should be able to try. And if CDI emulation isn't a thing, they will be lost forever. The NES is similarly having working hardware become incredibly difficult to find, but people aren't as bothered because Nintendo is seen to be putting its games on newer platforms, as well as fans 30 years ago. Okay, maybe some systems get official efforts to keep games playable, even if my opinion is the laziest attempt they can get away with, but the CDI and other such consoles are never going to get anything like that. And so if not preserved by us fans, we will lose a whole system's library. Well, fortunately, CDI emulation did reach a breakthrough in recent years, but it is far from the only unsuccessful weird system which I want to see kept afloat, and luckily for me, it doesn't seem to be the only one. We have had a big boom in recent years. Stuff like the Nokia N-Gage, the Panasonic 3DO, the Atari Jaguar and the Virtual Boy have become pretty well preserved, Virtual Boy even being possible in VR. You can argue that this is unnecessary. Okay, wow, I can emulate the Tiger Gamecom, but why would I want to? I'm sorry, but once again you really missed the point. Obviously I'm not deluded enough to expect regular people to be as infuriated as me at the lack of R-Zone or Gizmondo emulation, but I would argue that the failed experiment consoles are some of the more important to be able to look back on. If my example earlier, like 20 minutes ago in this video, of Resident Evil 2 on Game Boy Advance intrigued you, then how about Resident Evil 2 on the fucking Gamecom? And this wasn't cancelled, this actually released, and it's such a trip to look back at. But if you want to try it out of curiosity, then without emulation, you're restricted to forking over a couple of £100 on eBay for the privilege. In general, emulation has had a huge impact on the games that I love and has introduced me to so many, and it's the reason why 14 years on, I'm still obsessed with gaming history. Emulation is incredible, and if official emulators never catch up, I'm fine with that. But Cam isn't, he finds it really disappointing. When I sent him the script, he put that line in, so I've got to point that out. Fan emulators were more than good enough years ago, but they just keep getting better and better and better with every year that goes by. Constant updates and constant new features added, more consoles compatible, it's absolutely incredible. What I'm trying to convince you of in this video isn't that you shouldn't support official companies or that you must play emulators, because I know for most people, setting up emulators is a complete ball ache. So much stuff can go wrong, setting up controllers that you don't have the right drivers for, ROMs that don't work, ROM sites that don't work, different file formats, it's just a pain in the ass for a lot of people. And so I understand why they'd go, well, you know, I'll just pay a little bit and get Nintendo Online. If I was trying to tell you that you're wrong for the way you play it, then it's going completely against the whole message of this, which is that emulators help you play however you want. You can connect any controller to play in any way, any screen size, anything that you wouldn't get on the official hardware. I think obviously the controller support is also a great point for accessibility and other shit like that. Maybe Nintendo will tell us that it breaks at least 3 Geneva Conventions to get home improvement on the SNES off of Vim's Lair, but for me it's just Tuesday. Thank you so much if you've watched this far into this stupid fucking project that I've been working on for so many months. I really do appreciate it. This is obviously my first go at something like this, so any feedback or criticism I would really appreciate, because I know it was obviously a bit rough in places, but I do hopefully want to make sure any future videos are, you know, to a better standard. There are some people I have to thank. Well, actually, first of all, if this video goes up on the day that I want it to, which should be 8th of August, then happy birthday Mog, slopmog on YouTube, check them out, make some absolutely fantastic videos. I'd also like to thank Eleanor for helping with the script in a lot of parts. Going over and just, you know, changing bits that didn't sound right. Cam also helped with that, as well as Cam's role was more of a hired bully. I kind of got him to, if he ever saw that I wasn't working on the video, I'd get him to bully me, just to kind of speed up the process, because obviously it took a long time, not just because it's, you know, a long video, but because obviously I don't have experience doing something like this, so It took even longer than an experienced person would take to do something like this. I also really want to thank Max, who they drew the absolutely fantastic thumbnail art. So that was a big help. I knew if I was going to commission someone to do it, it would be Max, so thank you so much, Max. Bram, good friend Bram, came around and acted as a cameraman, or a Bramraman. That was incredibly helpful. I wasn't sure if I was going to have filmed sections, and I still don't know if it was like the best idea because it's terrible camera quality, but I don't have a tripod or anything, so I just needed him to just sit there and hold the camera, and it's very helpful. My lovely partner Liv for being very patient with this whole thing that's kind of taken over my life for a few months. It's been something I've talked about a lot, and I know that she probably has gotten sick of it, so thank you. Just any friends in general that, you know, helped me out. Jacob, my good friend, let me use his microphone because I didn't really have one. And also Jacob and his lovely girlfriend Rakaya watched one of the early drafts of this and helped out with any improvements or anything, which can go for a lot of my friends, to be fair. Early on I made a small version of it to send to people. That was tremendously helpful. That's basically all I wanted to say, is just thanking you for watching, shouting out people who have been incredibly helpful, and just if you've got any criticism or anything that could improve, then I'd really appreciate to hear it. See you hopefully soon. I don't know how long I'm going to take to make another fucking video. It won't be as long as this, I promise.